Somewhere in the Persian Gulf, a fleet of warships moves quietly through the night. Radar systems scan the horizon, fighter jets sit armed on runways, and in air-conditioned palace rooms from Riyadh to Abu Dhabi, diplomats are making urgent phone calls because the Middle East is once again standing at the edge of something no one can fully predict. The conflict between Israel and Iran has entered a phase that neither side anticipated, and now the Gulf Arab states, wealthy, powerful, and deeply exposed, are scrambling to contain a war that could consume the entire region. Iran has made its position brutally clear. This war ends on Tehran's terms, not Washington's, not Riyadh's, Tehran's. And that single declaration has sent a shockwave through every foreign ministry from Cairo to Kuwait City. To understand why this moment matters so much, you have to understand what the Gulf states actually are. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Oman. These are not just oil-rich monarchies. They are the financial spine of the global energy market. Roughly 20% of the world's oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway that Iran has threatened to close more than once. If that strait shuts down even for a week, fuel prices across Europe, Asia, and America spike dramatically, supply chains fracture, inflation returns, and governments that thought the Middle East was someone else's problem suddenly find themselves in a very serious conversation. That is the leverage Iran holds, and Tehran knows exactly how to use it. The Islamic Republic has spent decades building what military analysts call a strategy of asymmetric deterrence. Rather than matching the United States or Israel aircraft carrier for aircraft carrier, tank for tank, Iran built a web of proxies, missiles, and drones that could punish any attacker from multiple directions simultaneously. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, militia networks in Iraq and Syria. Each one is a loaded weapon pointed outward, and Iran holds the trigger. When Israeli and American strikes began degrading parts of this network, Tehran did not retreat, it recalibrated. But this is where things become more dangerous. Iran's supreme leadership made a calculation that a weakened proxy network actually changes their doctrine. Instead of fighting through intermediaries, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps began signaling a willingness to escalate directly. Ballistic missiles, hypersonic glide vehicles, precision cruise missiles that hug the terrain and avoid radar systems. Iran's missile arsenal, built quietly over 30 years and improved with technology transferred from Russia and North Korea, is now estimated to include over 3,000 ballistic and cruise missiles of varying ranges. Some of them can reach Tel Aviv. Some of them can reach American bases in Qatar, Bahrain, and the UAE. The Gulf states are not spectators in this drama. They are targets. That reality has pushed the monarchies of the Gulf Cooperation Council into an unprecedented diplomatic sprint. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has engaged Turkish President Erdogan, Chinese officials, and Omani intermediaries, all at the same time. The UAE, which spent years quietly normalizing ties with Israel under the Abraham Accords, now finds itself in a painful bind. It wants to preserve those economic relationships with Israel, but it cannot afford to appear as a staging ground for any operation against Iran. Abu Dhabi sits within range of Iranian missiles. That is not a hypothetical threat, it is geography. Qatar is playing its own delicate game. Home to the Al Udeid Air Base, the largest American military installation in the Middle East, housing roughly 10,000 U.S. personnel and dozens of combat aircraft, Qatar has simultaneously maintained a functioning relationship with both Hamas and Washington. Doha has served as a backroom channel in nearly every ceasefire negotiation of the past 2 years, but even Qatar's celebrated neutrality has limits. If Iran declares that diplomacy is over and the war continues only on its terms, Qatar's balancing act becomes almost impossible to sustain. What happened next changed everything about how the Gulf states perceived their own vulnerability. Iran's foreign minister delivered a statement that was measured in its language but devastating in its implications. Tehran would not accept any ceasefire framework that left Iran's nuclear program exposed to future military action. It would not accept any arrangement that dismantled the remaining elements of its regional proxy structure, and it would not accept American guarantees as substitutes for Iranian sovereignty over its own strategic decisions. In translation, this meant, we will not be disarmed by diplomacy while our enemies remain armed by Washington. The Gulf states heard this message not as bluster but as doctrine. Saudi Arabia's response was to quietly accelerate its own defense upgrades. The kingdom has been receiving advanced air defense batteries, F-15SA fighters with upgraded avionics, and has entered discussions about purchasing additional interceptor missile systems. The Saudi Air Defense Forces have been integrated more tightly with American CENTCOM, the U.S. military's central command headquartered in Qatar. Patriot missile batteries around Riyadh and Jeddah have been repositioned. The message from Riyadh is unspoken but unmistakable. We are preparing for a scenario we do not want but cannot ignore. The UAE took a different approach. Abu Dhabi's leadership leaned harder into diplomacy while simultaneously upgrading its THAAD, Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Battery, one of the most capable missile defense systems on Earth. The UAE became the first country outside the United States to acquire THAAD, and its operators have trained extensively with American counterparts. Paired with the Patriot systems already in country, the UAE has layered air defenses that would complicate any Iranian strike. But even the best missile defense is not perfect. And Iran has enough missiles to attempt saturation attacks, launching dozens simultaneously to overwhelm even the most advanced systems. This is the nightmare scenario Gulf planners wargame in private. Meanwhile, on the diplomatic front, Oman stepped forward as it has during previous crises. Muscat has served as a back channel between Washington and Tehran for decades, a role it plays with quiet professionalism and remarkable consistency regardless of which governments are in power. Omani officials began shuttling between capitals, carrying messages that public statements could not contain. The core question being tested was whether Iran's conditions, though publicly declared as non-negotiable, had any flexibility when discussed behind closed doors. The early signals were not encouraging. Iran's military establishment, particularly the IRGC, appeared to have gained influence over diplomatic positions in a way that made compromise structurally more difficult. The Revolutionary Guard is not simply a military organization. It is a political and economic empire inside Iran, controlling vast industrial enterprises, construction firms, and financial networks. It has a direct interest in the continuation of the conflict narrative because that narrative justifies its budget, its power, and its role inside Iranian society. When the IRGC says the war ends on Iran's terms, it is not just expressing strategic ambition, it is defending its own institutional survival. And here is where the global powers enter the picture in ways that cannot be separated from what happens next. Russia, bogged down in Ukraine but still determined to shape outcomes wherever it can, has continued supplying Iran with drone technology and defense components through channels that bypass Western sanctions. The relationship between Moscow and Tehran has deepened into something approaching a strategic partnership, though both sides are careful not to use that word publicly. Russian interest in Iranian theater escalation is cynical but rational. Every dollar America spends managing the Middle East is a dollar not spent arming Ukraine. Every American aircraft carrier repositioned to the Persian Gulf is one fewer asset that can be deployed to the North Atlantic. China's position is more complex and arguably more consequential. Beijing is Iran's largest trading partner and has signed a 25-year strategic cooperation agreement with Tehran. Chinese oil companies have been quietly purchasing Iranian crude at discounted rates, providing Tehran with the cash flow to sustain its military programs despite sanctions. But China has enormous economic exposure in the Gulf Arab states as well. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar together represent hundreds of billions in Chinese investment and trade. Beijing does not want a war that destroys its customers' infrastructure or closes the Strait of Hormuz to Chinese shipping. China has thus been playing a careful double role, sustaining Iran economically while privately urging restraint and positioning itself as a potential diplomatic broker if the situation deteriorates enough that even Washington would accept Chinese mediation. The United States, for its part, is navigating a crisis with fewer good options than its military power might suggest. American aircraft carrier strike groups have been deployed to the region, their presence intended as both deterrence and reassurance to Gulf partners. The USS Abraham Lincoln and its escort vessels represent enormous firepower. FA-18 fighters, Tomahawk cruise missiles, destroyers capable of intercepting ballistic missiles. But American military power is stretched across multiple theaters: Ukraine, the South China Sea, the Korean Peninsula. There is a limit to how many simultaneous commitments can be sustained at peak readiness, and Iran's strategists understand that limit intimately. They have studied American military logistics for decades. The diplomatic push from Gulf states therefore carries a weight that goes beyond traditional mediation. Riyadh and Abu Dhabi are not simply asking for a ceasefire. They are asking Iran to choose between two futures: a negotiated outcome in which Tehran retains some of its regional influence but accepts certain constraints, or an escalatory path that invites a level of military response that would genuinely threaten the Islamic Republic's survival as a functioning state. It is the most consequential offer Iran has received in decades, but will Iran accept it? The answer depends on something deeply internal to Iranian politics: the balance of power between pragmatists who understand what full-scale war would cost and ideologues who believe that resistance is both a religious obligation and a strategic asset. That internal contest has been playing out for years, and right now the ideologues appear to have the upper hand. The IRGC's public statements have been defiant. The supreme leader's language has been uncompromising. And the Iranian population, whatever its private frustrations with the government, tends to rally around national sovereignty when it feels the country is under existential pressure. This is the paradox the Gulf states cannot solve from the outside. What is unfolding in the Persian Gulf in these weeks and months is not simply a regional conflict. It is a test of whether the international architecture of deterrence, the network of military alliances, economic interdependencies, and diplomatic backchannels that has prevented a great power war since 1945, can hold under the pressure of a determined regional power that believes history is moving in its direction. Iran's leadership genuinely believes that American power is in relative decline, that Israel is isolated in ways it has never been before, and that the world's appetite for another Middle Eastern war is essentially zero. From Tehran's perspective, time and patience are strategic weapons. The Gulf states understand this, and that is precisely why their diplomacy is so urgent, so intensive, and so quietly desperate. If the mediation fails, if Iran's conditions remain maximalist and the conflict continues to expand, the consequences will not stay contained to the Middle East. Oil markets will convulse. American political pressure to act militarily will intensify. Russian and Chinese calculations will shift. And a region that has been the world's most volatile powder keg for half a century will have demonstrated once again that no amount of wealth, no quantity of missile defense batteries, and no number of diplomatic back channels can fully substitute for the one thing the Middle East has never managed to build in lasting form: a genuine regional peace. The ships are still moving through the Gulf. The radar systems are still scanning. The diplomats are still making their calls. And somewhere in Tehran, a decision is being made that will determine whether those calls were placed in time.